Welcome. My name is Wolf Gruner. I'm the director of the USC Shoah Foundation Center for Advanced Genocide Research, and since we talked about the Holocaust, there was this it is my special pleasure to welcome Maximilian Strnad. He is a German historian who's just finishing up his PhD at the University of Munich. And he is, although he is just finishing up his PhD, he is a very experienced and accomplished scholar already. So he published already 2 self-authored books on the topic of the Holocaust, on specifically on the topic of Jewish forced labor camps, and co-edited another volume. So this is very rare to have a PhD candidate with 3 major publications. So he came to us because he was also invited to be a fellow at the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., where he is currently in residence, and until when? End of December. So he has several months of time there to do research and writing up his dissertation. So it's my special pleasure to welcome him. Give him a hand. And he will talk about a very overlooked topic of the German side of the Holocaust, because he talks about Jews in mixed marriages, which usually are overlooked as a victim group because people tend to focus on the persecution of the Jews in general, and kind of start in 1933 and end in 1943 when the major deportations stopped. So he is looking more at the period after this time and what happened actually to those who remained in Germany and lived in mixed marriages. Maximilian Strnad.
So, Wolf, thank you for the kind introduction, and also I want to thank the USC Shoah Foundation for the invitation. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to present part of my current project on the history of the mixed marriages to you today. The project as a whole deals with the life of intermarried families under Nazi persecution and with their situation in post-war Germany. For this lecture, I will limit myself to the Nazi period. After providing you with some basic information on the situation of the mixed marriages from 1933 to 1943, I will focus on the very last years of persecution. This lecture is based on my recent researches for an article that was published these days in a special issue of Dapim on the late stage of the Shoah as a whole. As Wolf already said, in most books on the persecution of the German Jews, the last stage of persecution happens just to be a footnote. I'm even more happy to present this part of my research here at the USC Shoah Foundation because Wolf Gruner is one of the few Holocaust scholars at all who wrote on this largely under-researched period. So please do not wonder that you will hear his name from time to time. To be precise, I will mention his work twice. But before starting with the end, I will first briefly tell you more about the people who lived in mixed marriages, about the Jewish and non-Jewish spouses and their children, the so-called Mischlinge or half-Jews. In the following, I will use a lot of LTI, the Lingua Tertii Imperii, as well-known Victor Klemperer, who himself lived in a mixed marriage, tagged the language of the Third Reich. It is disturbing to use the perpetrator terms, but mixed marriages in particular were defined by Nazi racist categories. Nazi categorization such as Aryans versus Jews, half-Jews, people related to Jews, in German Jüdisch versippt, and people of German blood essentially determined the fate of these persecutees. The victims had to use these terms not only before Nazi authorities, but also in the post-war period to identify their very special common destiny. So please excuse that I will talk of Jews only as Jews in the racial definition of the Nuremberg laws, and that I am sometimes using horrible terms like clearing for displacement and killing to refer to Nazi strategy and thinking. Let me begin by providing you with some statistical background information. When the National Socialists came to power in 1933, there were about 525,000 Jews living in the German Reich. Roughly 35,000 of them were married to a non-Jewish partner. These numbers refer only to Jews by faith. But many Jews, especially those who were married to a non-Jewish partner, had converted to Christianity, making the total number of people designated as Jews under the racial definition of the Nazis much higher. In 1935, the Nuremberg laws banned marriage between Jews and persons of German blood. Existing mixed marriages persisted. The Nuremberg laws not only defined a Jew as someone who had at least 3 Jewish grandparents, but also changed their status to that of second-degree citizens, thereby denying them major civil rights. The Nuremberg laws also categorized children of mixed marriages as Mischlinge. These half-Jews were treated better than the Jews and initially retained all of their civil rights. However, the Nuremberg laws excluded them from many parts of German social and cultural life. For example, they were not allowed to marry a non-Jew, and they were denied attendance in high schools and universities. The Nuremberg laws separated the half-Jews into 2 categories. Besides the Mischlinge, who were raised as Christians or had no religious denomination, the half-Jews that belonged to, in one or another way, to the Jewish religious community were defamed as so-called Geltungsjuden. That means persons that were legally considered as Jews. By 1939, a significant portion of German Jews had emigrated. In June 1939, there were about 330,000 Jews still living in Germany, among them 20,000 who were intermarried. As the number indicates, a lot of the intermarried Jews had left Germany. Some of these Jewish partners left alone, while others were accompanied by their families. Still other couples severed their marriages through divorce. Both intermarried Jews and their non-Jewish spouses were hit full force by the Reich's anti-Jewish laws and measures. For example, Jews were not the only ones ousted from their jobs. Quite often, the Aryan partners lost their positions too, and had to accept poorly paid jobs instead if they managed to get one at all. This was especially true in the public sector. By 1933, a law prohibited not only the employment of non-Aryan officials, that's the way the Nazis called the Jews, but also of non-Jews married to a Jew. This law was expanded in 1937. The non-Jewish officials who were closely related to Jews were dismissed into early retirement. These developments increased the pressure on mixed couples to seek a divorce, because the only way to keep one's job was to leave his or her Jewish spouse. This pressure ruined the life of the Jahn family in Immenhausen, a small town near Kassel in northern Germany. The case illustrates the extent of Jewish persecution on individuals living in mixed marriages, and how it subverted the relations with one another. Lilian was a Jew. She was running a prosperous doctor's office along with her non-Jewish husband Ernst. She retired after she gave birth to her first 2 children. The family was well off and part of the cultural elite in their community. Ernst Jahn was a renowned physician. The couple was often invited to cultural events and dinners. This changed dramatically after the Nazi rise to power. Everyone began to turn their backs on the family, and they stopped receiving invitations. Other physicians only contacted Ernst Jahn in case of immediate emergency and mainly by phone. They avoided coming to his office for fear of being seen together with a man who was married to a Jew. He suffered constant indignities, and his wife also suffered because she felt guilty for it. I quote, "This all is just happening to him because he is married to me, a Jew. Can you imagine how that saddens my heart and how terribly this all hurts? She complained to a close friend. The relationship began to erode. Let's take a closer look to the case of the Jahn family, because it will reveal how much the daily life of intermarried couples changed. The separation of the family from its natural environment was completed as early as February 1934. I quote, "The social boycott towards us here in Immenhausen is of such unimagined totality, I almost do not leave the house at all. On the rare occasions when she had to exit her private castle, as Victor Klemperer once described his asylum near Dresden, Lily always dropped her head that nobody had to be embarrassed of greeting or ignoring her. In fact, she also protected herself in this way from the shame of being disregarded by her neighbors and former friends." This was the fate of many Jewish women living in mixed marriages during this period. While their Jewish male counterparts still had social contacts with other people, at least at work, the daily life of those women was more and more restricted to the home and the family, and to their Jewish relatives and friends. As most other Jews had left Immenhausen, and Lily's parents and sisters had emigrated, she was totally isolated. Long before it was forbidden for Jews to go to the cinemas, to theaters, and to so many other public places in 1938, Lily had no opportunity to spend time together with her husband outside of her home. I quote, "We lack every relief or stimulation," she stated. The constant mortification, the lack of social acceptance and cultural participation finally destroyed this couple's relationship. Ernst Jahn started to go out with a non-Jewish woman in order to finally again participate in social life, fell in love with her, and left his wife Lily. I will come back on this case later. Let's switch back to the chronological implementation of anti-Jewish measures. Nazi officials intensified the persecution of the Jews right after Kristallnacht on the 9th of November 1938, while simultaneously sparing one special group of Jews of some of the most severe persecution measures. The Nazis introduced the category of privileged mixed marriages at the end of 1938. From then on, intermarried families with a Jewish husband and children being categorized as Geltungsjuden found themselves in a less favorable position than families with an Aryan husband or with children being considered Mischlinge. This differentiation gendered the persecution of intermarried Jews to a high degree. Following the ideology of Nazi racial antisemitism, thus Jewish men were feared as a threat to German women and the purity of German blood. More Jewish men had married non-Jewish women than the way around. Many Jews who had married non-Jewish partners had converted to Christianity, or at least left the Jewish community, and their children were often baptized. This type of mixed marriage, which represented the majority, was classified as privileged. They received better food rations and were not required to wear the Yellow Star of David from 1941 on. They were usually not ghettoized in so-called Jewish houses either. You may be asking yourself why the Nazis invented this category and created a two-tier society of persecution. As one part of the family was non-Jewish, the mixed marriages had strong ties to the Aryan community of blood, the so-called Volksgemeinschaft. Their children were also closely related to the Volksgemeinschaft. In 1938, Mischlinge still had to serve in the Wehrmacht, in the German army, and many were part of the Hitler Youth and the Bund Deutscher Mädel. The Nazi leadership did not want to deal with conflicts with the non-Jewish relatives if they were to ghettoize and expose these people, especially not in times of an upcoming war. This was also the reason why all mixed marriages were exempted from deportation, at least until shortly before the end of the war. This unequal treatment of Aryans in mixed marriages allowed Nazi officials on the one hand to raise pressure on the women so that they would divorce their Jewish husbands, while also pushing them back toward the German community of blood, thereby allowing these women to avoid most persecution measures. This path was also destined to destroy solidarity among the Jewish victims. The policy was successful and continued to affect Jews even after the end of the Nazi regime. The stigma of privilege associated with being related to a non-Jew remained intact after the war and made second-class victims out of these persecuted members of privileged mixed marriages, as they did not get supplementary relief and were disadvantaged in their claims for compensation. Before I come to the second part of my paper, let me quickly summarize the situation of the mixed marriages in the first stage of the war. From 1939 on, Jews living in non-privileged mixed marriages lived under severe persecution. Some marriages ended in divorce, while other families decided to emigrate after the shocking experience of Kristallnacht, when also Jewish men of mixed marriages were arrested and imprisoned in concentration camps. This resulted in the decrease of non-privileged mixed marriages to 25% of all mixed marriages in late 1944. Beginning in October 1941, the total number of Jewish individuals in mixed marriages decreased far less than among other Jews. This was due to the fact that Jews living in persisting mixed marriages were spared from deportations. Only 6% of German Jews were married to a non-Jewish partner up until 1939. By the end of 1944, the numbers had flipped. Now 85% of the remaining German Jews were part of a mixed marriage. Following the mass deportations in September 1944, some 12,000 of the approximately 14,000 Jews still living in the territory of Germany proper, the so-called Alt Reich, were intermarried. The number speaks for themselves. Many Jews with a non-Jewish partner survived the Shoah because of the exemptions afforded to them. Can it be said, however, that mixed marriage, especially privileged mixed marriage, guaranteed the survival of the Jewish partner as claimed by many survivors' organizations after the war? I will now address this topic by looking closer on the last year of the persecution. As Wolf already mentioned, mass deportations of German Jews largely ended in March 1943 with the so-called factory action. During this large roundup, several thousand Jews, most of them in Berlin, were arrested all over the Reich at their workplaces and deported mainly to Auschwitz. While also many intermarried Jews were arrested in order to clarify their status and to rearrange their labor deployment, they still were to be exempt from deportation. This reality continued to displease members of the Gestapo and party bodies because they disapproved of the fact that mixed marriages were spared from central persecution methods and deportation. Intermarried Jews would have already been integrated in the final solution after the Wannsee Conference in early 1942 if these parties had had their way. They instead sought other ways to persecute these Jews on a regional level and to remove them from their spheres of influence. In different regions, the Gestapo leaders, together with the Gau leaderships, who were the main party authorities in their regions, opted for taking them into protective custody, in German Schutzhaft, on fallacious grounds and sending them to a concentration camp. The Gestapo of Hessen-Nassau in particular used this practice to deport several hundred Jews who were intermarried to Auschwitz, where they were murdered. Ongoing protests by family members and the advocates forced the Reichssecurity main office to stop these local actions in late summer 1943. However, a pattern developed that was to determine the persecution methods of Jews in mixed marriages during the last year of the war. The persecution of mixed marriages became more radical on a local level. To this end, the authorities opted with the help of existing persecution measures and used their region-specific leeway to target these Jews. Many of the formerly intermarried Jews, meaning those who had divorced or whose partners had died, were already deported in 1941 and 1942. From 1942 on, those who had lived in privileged mixed marriage were officially excluded in the deportation guidelines. At the end of 1943, the Reichssecurity main office ordered the deportation of almost all Jews whose mixed marriages had ended. Only few who had to take care of young children were spared under some preconditions. Beginning in January 1944, the Gestapo officers of the Reich opted about 1,000 Jews to Terezin. Most of them subsequently fell victim to the selections and died in the gas chambers of Auschwitz. One of those formerly intermarried Jews who died in Auschwitz was Lilian, who was divorced in 1942. Shortly before this roundup, the Reich Security Main Office started to target the non-Jewish husbands of mixed marriages and the Mischlinge at the end of 1943. The idea was to make them eligible for forced labor. Chief of Security Policy and Security Service Ernst Kaltenbrunner intended to use those persons who were, in Nazi terminology, unworthy to bear arms in segregated labor battalions of the Organisation Todt, the so-called OT. However, it took the Nazi leadership too long to come to an affirmative decision, and the armament industry refused to resign on these workmen. So at that point, the attempt failed to a large extent. The Reich Security Main Office gained more and more power after the Stauffenberg's assassination attempt on Hitler failed in the summer of 1944. They used its leeway also to radicalize the persecution of the last remaining German Jews. Now Heinrich Himmler ordered a concerted action, or, first mentioning, as Wolf Gruner called it, a second factory action, on October 6 of that year. Himmler instructed the Gestapo officers to remove all intermarried Aryans and all Mischlinge from their current positions and to hand them over to the OT. Probably far more than 10,000 persons who were closely related to Jews had to endure this kind of labor deployment. Aryan intermarried and Mischlinge were the only ones targeted for these special OT labor battalions. Jews and Geltungsjuden were expelled generally from OT service. However, in Military District 6, which covered the Rhineland and Westphalia, a great number of intermarried Jews and Geltungsjuden had been sent to several OT camps sometime before the second factory action started on October 6, 1944. These different circumstances have hardly received any attention in Holocaust studies. What was the background of this action, and why did it remain restricted to a specific region? The Western Front pushed further into the German heartland in autumn 1944. On September 12, the US Army reached German borders at Aachen. The NS leadership feared uprisings and reacted with massive terror to all signs of disintegration. Not only foreign forced laborers and communists were regarded as a safety issue, but also the last remaining German Jews. Most of them were living in privileged mixed marriages. As deportation of intermarried Jews was still prohibited, higher SS police leader, the so-called HSSPF of Military District 6, his name was Karl Guttenberg, who was in charge of internal security, together with the Gau leaders took advantage of the current OT deployment to get rid of these last Jews. The Gestapo headquarters of Military District 6 took great efforts in preparation for this, what they called an evacuation. At this point, I have to interrupt to clarify how the term evacuation is used in this context. The Nazis generally used the term evacuation as euphemistic paraphrase to disguise deportation. As there is no other equivalent of the German term Räumung in English, I have to use evacuation, but I want to pinpoint the fact that Nazi officials explicitly used not the same term because deportation of intermarried Jews was still prohibited, and, as I will explain in the following, the evacuation of Military District 6 had other background than deportation. At the beginning of September 1944, the responsible Gestapo headquarters of Düsseldorf, however, ordered the representative in charge, Dr. Ernst Blankenstein of the Reichsassociation of the Jews, to visit and check all addresses of all local Jews. Then on the morning of September 17th, Blankenstein, who himself had been scheduled for the transport, was ordered to call up all Jews to present themselves at the slaughterhouse, which had already been used as a collection point for the previous deportations. All in all, there were about 240 Jewish intermarried and Geltungsjuden from the whole Rhineland region, men and women in roughly equal proportions, gathering at the slaughterhouse in September 1944. These people spent the night there and were transported the following morning. The women's railway cars were uncoupled along the way and brought to the town of Minkwitz near Zeitz in Saxony. The men's cars reached the village of Vorwohle in Lower Saxony that same evening. So I put it on a map because even for me as someone who's living in southern Germany, I don't know where those places all are, so I think this is quite more impossible for you. All in all, this action came as a surprise to the Jews as well as to the OT leadership, who had not been included in the preparation plans. No one in Vorwohle was prepared to process or care for these Jews, as they had not been notified of their arrival. The Jewish forced laborers waited almost 2 hours in the streets in front of the railway station until the local police arranged makeshift accommodation for them in a barn for the night. This situation persisted the following day. Finally, the police escort went to the Gestapo office in Holzminden for further instructions. Some OT supervisors from the Lenne construction site appeared around noon as a result of these inquiries. The construction supervisors declared 72 of the roughly 120 Jewish men to be fit for work. The labor camp where they were scheduled to work was still under construction. Therefore, the Jewish men were first used for building the barracks. Those found unfit for forced labor, most of them were senior citizens, had to stay in Vorwohle for 1 whole week before they were redirected. They were finally brought to an assembly camp at a Jewish hospital in Berlin, as it was still forbidden to deport Jews who were intermarried. Evacuation continued over the course of the following days in Westphalia, where at least 330 intermarried Jews were rounded up in 2 consecutive actions. The women were admitted to the OT labor camps in Elben and Bettenhausen near Kassel in northern Germany. The men were split up into different camps near Zeitz in Thuringia. The Gestapo office of Cologne-Achengau had informed mayors and county heads of the impending action as early as September 11th. The Gestapo in Bonn transferred at least 220 Jews together with their relatives to the Müngersdorf collection camp by truck. The non-Jewish spouses were released shortly afterwards. The Gestapo instructed them to leave their hometowns immediately. Probably on September 15, some 300 Jewish intermarried were displaced. Women were brought to OT camps near Kassel, men to Zeitz in Saxony, and to a chemical plant of Leunawerke near Halle. With this step, the western provinces of the German heartland were largely cleansed of Jewish enemies in preparation of the Reich's defense. The Gestapo office of Cologne rather self-righteously summed up the situation on November 9, I quote, "Here the action against Jews, Jewish Mischlinge and persons related to Jews ordered by the Reichsführer SS had already been prepared and carried out in the course of the evacuation even before the order was issued." This statement shows that the so-called Räumung of Jewish intermarried in September 1944 was not just simply an early part of the deployment of persons unworthy to bear arms brought forward for local reasons, or a continuation of the deportations. The report refers to an action that was prepared and carried out within the scope of the clearance of Military District 6 of the Reich's enemies. The action did not remain restricted to the mass transports of September 1944. Apart from intermarried Jews, which had been transferred to the camps, a large number, presumably the elder and sick, was sent to Berlin. This transfer took several months. At the end of February 1945, there were 290 Jewish intermarried from Military District 6 interned in an emergency accommodation at the Jewish Hospital of Iranische Straße in Berlin. Summed up, the evacuation of Military District 6 affected with some 1,000 intermarried and Geltungsjuden more than the half of the remaining Jews of that region. There was a second region where intermarried Jews and Geltungsjuden were transferred to segregated labor camps of the OT. The Jews in Breslau, on the other side of the Reich, were also affected by these actions. However, these Jews were targeted differently than their brethren as this action did initially not concern the evacuation of Jews from Military District 8. Nevertheless, here as well, the Gau leadership and the Gestapo used their authority to exploit the labor force made available with the roundup of these German Jews. Like tens of thousands of national Germans, Hitler Youth, foreign forced laborers and inmates of concentration camps, the Jewish intermarried had to perform construction work for the defense lines at the eastern borders of the Reich, within the so-called Operation Barthold. An anti-tank ditch was to be dug roughly 30 kilometers north of Breslau in order to stop the advance of the Red Army. From July 1944, several transports of intermarried, Geltungsjuden and Mischlinge were brought to a number of OT camps near the village of Drachenberg in Lower Silesia. These camps were abolished in January 1945, with the Red Army a short distance from Breslau. It was at this point that the evacuation of the Reich's enemies began. The Jews and Mischlinge, along with inmates of concentration camps and forced laborers, had to march in the direction of the concentration camp of Groß-Rosen. Being completely exhausted by hard physical labor and insufficient food rations in the camps, many died along the way of the forced march. Shortly after this, on January 27, the Gestapo conducted an additional evacuation among the Jews of Breslau. Erwin Ludnowski, the local representative in charge of the Reichsassociation, had to lead 40 Jews, most of them intermarried, by foot from Breslau to Groß-Rosen. When the SS abandoned the camp 10 days after their arrival, its inmates were forced on a death march to Bergen-Belsen. The Jewish intermarried of Breslau had been caught in the maelstrom of the concentration camp system, and very few of them survived. This illustrates that Breslau officials also carried off a large part of the remaining Jewish enemies of the Reich as soon as the region was declared the immediate frontline and Breslau a fortress. The Reich Security Main Office prepared for its final battle in the rest of German heartland shortly after the Gestapo had evacuated the remaining Jews of the two most exposed regions of the German Reich. Now the Reich Security Main Office changed its policy on the deportation and ordered the evacuation of all Jews from all parts of the Reich on January 19, 1945 to Terezin. At the beginning of February, the deportation orders were sent out. They disguised the impending deportation as an induction to priority or segregated external labor employment, which was, I quote again, not to be confused with one of the previously conducted evacuations, means transports to the camps in the east. The Gestapo wanted to ensure that those marked for deportation would not flee. In many cases, the tactic worked all too well. Eva Noack-Mosse, who lived in Oberstdorf near the former Austrian border, had suspected that she was being deported when she received the Gestapo's letter. It's what was about the same in this one. But the text was the same as in the letter which had ordered her Aryan husband to OT service only days before. In order to make sure, she made inquiries with the Gestapo office in Augsburg that was in charge of her case. They reassured her, I quote, "You know about the OT camps, where the Aryan spouses and Mischlinge work. There those of German blood are being drafted into the Wehrmacht right now. You are to take up their work in the office and the canteen." This reassured her, and Eva Noack-Mosse decided to follow the order of labor employment. It was only when the transport reached Terezin on February 22 that she realized the reality of her deception. She recorded, I quote, "I was mad at myself for months for having been so gullible. I had been such a fool to imagine that in February 1945 I still believed the Gestapo's information. How could my instinct have failed me so utterly?" There were around 14,500 Jews still living in the Altreich at the beginning of 1945. 12,500 were married to a non-Jewish partner, and about 9,500 of these marriages were privileged. In spring 1945, 1,900 persons were carried off in 19 transports from the Altreich to Terezin. Due to the disparate availability of sources, it is impossible to reconstruct the exact composition of the group of deportees. As the deportations were declared work transports, most of the persons concerned were in their Middle Ages. The vast majority were intermarried Jews. Most of them, maybe 2/3, were spouses of privileged mixed marriages. About 20% lived in non-privileged mixed marriages, and around 15% were Geltungsjuden. The last statistics from the Reichsassociation for March 1945 confirm these numbers. Jewish officials were only able to give approximate figures, as reports by the regional representatives are missing. Some of them had been scheduled on the last transports. This is this last handwritten statistic. According to this statistic, there were still 10,500 intermarried Jews living in the German Reich, 8,000 of them with privileged status. In their majority, the deportees of 1945 were men. And this fact needs an explanation, as it does not correspond to the gender ratio of all German Jews deported from the Reich. Not only this, in the beginning of 1945, Jewish women in privileged mixed marriages made up by far the largest group among the remaining Jews. Nevertheless, they were deported to a much smaller extent. This is another example of the above-mentioned pattern of persecution generally prevailing for mixed marriages. The authorities heavily attacked families with Jewish husbands for ideological reasons, even if their mixed marriage had a privileged status. Although the action in the spring of 1945 was the greatest deportation wave since the 1943 factory action, only a small fraction of 13% of the remaining Jewish intermarried and Geltungsjuden was actually taken. There are various reasons for that. When comparing the regions of origin for the deportees, it becomes clear that the action's core areas were the northern and central parts of Germany, whereas the transports from the south were mainly small. The highest proportion was deported in Hesse and Nassau, where 40% of all local Jews were carried off. This is not a huge surprise, as the Frankfurt Gestapo had been following a consistently tough stance against Jewish intermarried all along. In central Germany, 34% of all remaining Jews were deported. In Dresden, the deportation prepared for February 16 could not be carried out anymore, as the town had been largely destroyed by Allied air raids only days before. Had it not been for that, the action's extent would have been even bigger than in Hesse. In northwestern Germany, nearly 31% of all remaining Jews were deported. In Military District 6, as shown, a large part of the Jewish intermarried had already been carried off to OT labor camps during the above-mentioned evacuation in September 1944. Many escaped from the camps, but still 315 persons were deported from there. And this is quite interesting. This is the last page of the deportation decree from February 19th, 45. And as you can see here, there's an annex on the last page. And this annex says that the Jews who have been transferred earlier from the regions close to the front line to the labor deployment at OT are to be included in the action. And I want to show that because this is central to my argumentation. That this was a clearance of those regions that were under fire. In Silesia, most Jews had been transferred to Groß-Rosen already in January 1945. Like in East Prussia, Pomerania, and Eastern Brandenburg, the approaching front made deportations impossible. In Berlin, a date for the deportation of Jewish intermarried had already been set. However, the great infrastructural damage and the lack of transportation possibilities prevented the action. In southwestern Germany, 24% of all remaining Jews were deported. However, slightly less than 12% were transported from Bavaria. In Bavaria, the regional asynchronicity is most striking. In Augsburg, more than half of the Jews were deported. In Munich, the action was implemented comparatively poor. Unlike other regions, the persecution pressure here had decreased a little since mid-1943. Up to that time, especially, the Aryanization department, the so-called Arisierungsstelle, had played a central role in the persecution of the Jews. But then, in mid-1943, this radically anti-Semitic department of the Gau leadership in Upper Bavaria was to a large extent dissolved. The Gestapo's Department of Jewish Affairs, the so-called Judenreferat, was headed by an old Catholic police officer who, without wanting to diminish his role in the persecution of the Jews, did not proceed against the Munich Jews with the same severity that was, for example, displayed by his counterpart in Hanover, Christian Heinrichsmeyer, or in Frankfurt, Heinrich Barb. There are many reported cases where the Munich Gestapo officials accepted the medical certificates and statements of indispensability as reasons for postponements in February 1945. As the end of the war drew nearer, the officials tried to cover their backs and lay the ground for positive references in the time after the collapse, and in some cases this worked all too well. In Franconia, no transports at all were executed. Devastating air raids had widely destroyed the infrastructure in Nuremberg. The Gestapo headquarters were hit, and the Jewish registry was lost. So this is the reason why the asynchronicity in Bavaria is so striking. In addition to these local differences, there were further reasons why only about 1/7 of all remaining German Jews was deported to Terezin in the spring of 1945. The chaos caused by air raids and the approaching front made it more difficult for the authorities to get a hold on their victims, and in turn easier for the latter to cover their tracks. Many of the Jews receiving a deportation order in February 1945 decided to go underground. They received help from non-Jewish friends and family members. This way, many places like Frankfurt, Hamburg, and Munich witnessed veritable waves of flight. A high percentage of the remaining Jews were rounded up in regions where the Gestapo was able to execute the deportation decree of the Reich Security Main Office. However, this was not always the case, and the fact that deportations were impossible in some regions explains why the total number of deportees in the spring of 1945 was relatively small. The very fact that no transports took place in Berlin spared 40% of the last German Jews from a transfer to Terezin. So, to conclude, the forces inside the Nazi leadership who preferred to postpone the solution of the mixed marriage issue for reasons of domestic policy had prevailed until 1943. Until that time, it had appeared that a persisting intermarriage guarantees the survival of the Jewish spouse. But neither the Reich Security Main Office nor the leading NSDAP officials were prepared to accept this position. In the second half of 1944, the political will to deport Jewish intermarried living in sustaining marriages grew stronger and stronger. In September 1944, the Gestapo, in cooperation with the Gau leadership, had gained considerable leeway for defending the Reich. They used it to clear Military District 6 and the city of Breslau, which had been declared war zones, of the last Jews. They took advantage of the ongoing deployment of persons unworthy to be armed in order to carry out this action, as deportation of intermarried Jews still was prohibited. On January 19, 1945, the Reich Security Main Office ordered the deportation of intermarried Jews from the whole of the German Reich to Terezin. This can be seen as the last attempt to make the Reich free of Jews. The Nazi leadership did not need to take concerns of domestic policy into consideration anymore due to the war situation. It becomes obvious, however, that the actions of Nazi officials were increasingly determined by questions of defense strategy. The Reich itself had become a war zone and was to be cleansed of potential enemies in order to obtain domestic security. The persecution of the Jews remained an open process until the very end of the war. It was adapted to the respective situation and, according to Wolf Gruner, I quote, significantly shaped by the acting persons. However, his convincing thesis that this process was based on, I quote, ideological and economic interests needs, in my point of view, to be complemented for the final stage, as the will to target the last Jews in 1944-45 was increasingly influenced by arguments, or at least the pretext of security policy. The Reich Security Main Office submitted order to stop this action in mid-March of 1945, when the war reached German soil. a good 10,000 of the approximately 14 to 15,000 German Jews liberated in the Altreich had a non-Jewish spouse. Most of the intermarried had converted to Christianity or at least left Judaism. Due to the late deportation, a large number of those Jews returning from the East, mainly from Terezin, were intermarried too. In consequence, the surviving German Jews were to a large extent non-Jewish by faith. The total number of Shoah victims among the Jewish intermarried is unknown. They number in the thousands. Thus, intermarriage with a non-Jewish spouse by no means guaranteed the survival of German Jews, especially in the final stage of war. Their fate remained negotiable until the very end and depended to a high degree on regional circumstances. Still, it gave most of them, as Beate Meyer put it so appropriately, the delay necessary for survival. When the Reich Security Main Office ordered a comprehensive deportation of intermarried Jews at the beginning of 1945, the preconditions of the systematic extermination were not given anymore, and so most of them had the fortune to survive. Thank you.
I just want to make sure I understood correctly. You said that the reason the intermarried Jews were left alone at the beginning was that the Reich didn't want to deal with breaking up families or getting complaints from the families?
The situation in 1938 is that the Mischlinge, the children of those families, had to serve in the army, and because the war was upcoming, they didn't want to have problems with those families, like persecuting those families. Actually, the decree or the time when that happens is the question of ghettoization. So Hitler and Himmler and Göring are sitting together and they're thinking about new possibilities after Kristallnacht to target the Jews. And they're talking about ghettoization, and that's the point where they put Jews into Jewish houses, into ghettos, into camps. And at that point, they have the problem if they put those families also together with all other Jews, their children who would have to serve in the army or who are together with Aryans in the Hitler Youth, they would have also be sent to those Jewish houses and ghettos, and so they may make an exemption. So this is the situation end of 1938. It is not the question about breaking up families. It's about preserving the Mischling part from being pushed into a Jewish context. Because they still, at that point, they still wanted to use their force for work and for service in the military. This will change 41 and the following years.
Do you have an idea of the number of missionaries at that point?
No, actually, I think this will be a number that we will never have. But there may be some 20,000.
To serve in the army?
So
in
it
the
must have
army,
been a large enough number that they
To serve in the
made.
army?
To serve in the army, 20,000, but
Around 20,000.
but in total, the total number of the Mischlinge is much higher.
But it's okay.
And the problem is that we have Mischling of first degree, so this is those with 2 Jewish grandparents, and then we have Mischlinge of second degree, which only have 1 Jewish grandparent. So the total number of those is goes probably far more than 100,000, but we have only the numbers from the statistics. So there was a statistic in 1939, but the problem is that if you manage to change your religious status before a certain point, so sometimes the authorities don't know that you are Jewish. So maybe if your grandparents already changed or converted to Christianity, you're not Jewish. Because this is something weird, because the Nazis focus on the question of race, but to explain who is a Jew, they have to focus on the religion of the grandparents.
I'm curious about the, you mentioned the people who survived and the treatment, how you perceive their treatment by other survivors of a Jewish background?
After the war?
After the war? What was the, I didn't quite understand that.
So there is a hierarchy, generally there's a hierarchy after the war, an internal hierarchy in the question of who suffered the most. So you have those problems between Jews and communists, for example, because the communists said that, okay, you were targeted by race, and the communists always said, or some of them said, that we fought against fascism. And in Eastern Berlin, for example, this is the reason why the first month or the first year they will get higher relief, because they were fighters against fascism. This was the term.
So this
and
is within East Germany or within
this
West
is
Germany?
this is no, this is within East Germany, but in general you have there's a fight going on among the victims themselves, who suffered the most. So not everybody is doing that, but the organizations are trying to giving rules who has the right to apply for relief and for care packages and things like that, and they have to present categories. So if you were into an East European examination camp, you get a higher relief than somebody who survived in Germany.
What do you mean relief?
Like care packages, food supplies, yeah, access to housing, for example.
So, yeah, I think it's kind of odd to use similar terminology for before and after the war, no? I mean, whatever discomfort, if you're at the bottom of the line and you're in a former death camp and now you're waiting to go to Israel or go to some other place in a DPU camp, I would say that's a very different kind of treatment than the treatment they had received that sent them into the camp, no?
Yeah, I'm not talking about that. It's a different situation after the war, and the question is now, who gets aid, who gets help, who gets access to food supply. This has nothing to do with, or it has to do with the kind, or how you were persecuted in Nazi times. Because if you had, and this is, I think this is quite striking. So if you had suffered very hard in the camps, you were starving, you need more medical aid and food supply after the war to recover. This is the question that they are dealing with. And the problem of the mixed marriages is they survived in the German Reich. Many of them were not sent to the camps in the East. And at that point, there's a discussion going on among the victims, and many organizations say, okay, you survived in Germany, you were privileged. They used the term, you were privileged, and that's why you now will not get the same amount of food supply. And there's another reason, because the Jewish Help Organization just gave food supplies to Jews by faith, not persecuted under the racial criteria of the Nazis. So they denied actually most of the Jews living in mixed marriage supplementary relief, because they said, okay, you're not Jewish. And on the other hand, in 45 and also in 46, this changes at the end of the year 46, the German organizations weren't able to give anything away. They didn't have anything. There was no. So care is starting in the fall of 46, and many of those who survived in mixed marriages only get relief in 47. So this is the situation they are facing right after the war, and this is why what I was saying, this stigma of being privileged because being related closely to a non-Jew is also a topic in the post-war time.
So thank you very much for your talk. I think the last part of the evacuation from the border this was very new and interesting. I have a question. You mentioned just in brief that from this region more than 1,000 Jews were evacuated, but you mentioned also this was half of the Jewish population. What happened to the rest?
So some of them fled actually. There's a flight movement also in this region 44. Some of them were sent back. There are some cases where non-Jewish relatives successfully asked for the authorities to bring their relatives back. And this is also quite interesting. Some of the non-Jewish husbands followed their Jewish husbands to the camps and lived next to that region, and sometimes they succeeded in helping them to get out of the camps. Basically, you have some postponements. For example, for medical reasons, but also for reasons if you had young children, for example, that you have to take care of, there are some exemptions. And when this first roundup passed by, there was some local regions for second one, those who were sent to Berlin, and I don't have too many data for that, but I think that those who were sent to Berlin were mainly the elder ones. And so there's so some people stay, but I cannot tell you how was the proportion of people who went underground and who got a postponement. This is also, I think, for the authorities, this is also a period that is it's really chaotic. So they try to get hold of those people, and they managed to get 50%, but it's quite hard to get all of them, because, as I said at the end of the talk, the situation is better for the victims now. They have the possibility to go underground. Not really to go underground. It's just they just had simply to switch to another, like to a friend's house, or move to the countryside. Just not telling the authorities that they are moving, and so this is already sufficient at that time, so often. And there is not so much persecution about people who are going underground. But in some cases, for example, in Cologne, we have the case of a woman who is going underground in September '44, and she is caught by the authorities and sent to Bergen-Belsen, not to Ravensbrück, sorry. And then she's dying there beginning of '45. So we also have those cases. And what I didn't mention at all. The question about the late crimes, the Endkriegsverbrechen. There are also some intermarried Jews who are being targeted by the Einsatzgruppen and by local authorities, and, for example, getting shot just in the backyard of their houses. Not many of them, but some.
So I'm sorry to keep coming back. First
Yeah.
of all, I really enjoyed your talk. Thank you so
Thanks.
much. So there's something that's difficult for me, a lot that's difficult for me to process in life, but in your talk, because being Jewish was a question of race, not faith, right, for the Reich. So, for example, Iranian Jews who lived in Europe, Germany, France, and elsewhere, were not considered Jews. They were allowed to leave. For example, they were deported because somebody managed to convince, the Iranian diplomats managed to convince the authorities that they were not Semitic people, right? That they were of Iranian race, which was supposed to be Aryan, right? And even though there had been 3,000 years, they'd been Jews for 3,000 years, and all their ancestors were Jewish, that they weren't Semitic, and so they were given a pass, right? So then you have these Jews who have converted, so their faith is not Jewish, but by race they are Jewish. So within the internal logic of the Reich, it seems to me there had to be some sort of a way to give exemption to these people, because otherwise to say we're not going to ghettoize them or we're not going to move them because their children are going to be serving in the war doesn't really rhyme with the racial logic.
Because the thing is that it's not about religion. So if there were many Jews where one or both partners or that are not married converted to Christianity and they are deported, it's not a question about religion. It's just a question of being married to a non-German by blood. This is the difference. So, like, people converted who are not married to a non-German, they were deported. It's only about those people who are mixed marriages and who have children that are mixed, like half Jewish, half Aryan, whatever. This is the difference. And the story you were focusing on, I think it's is it the Portuguese action in Netherlands? So where they tried to get out by saying that they converted already 500 years ago, and that's why they are not Jewish anymore.
No, I'm talking about Iranian Jews.
Yeah.
And there was a diplomat in France who's known as the Iranian Schindler, who saved 3,000 Jews.
Okay. Yeah.
Not just Iranian Jews, also European Jews, by saying that they're not Semitic.
Okay. We have the same situation, for example, in Romania, that the church was able to save converts. It always depends. It depends on the country. It's not the same procedure in Germany than it is in France or it is in Romania. But one can say that basically Jewish converts were hit by full force in most countries, and there are only some exceptions.
Maybe I could just add one point. I think the context is also important. The Nazi leadership was very heavily informed by the experience of the First World War. And their idea of the First World War was Germany lost because the Jews stabbed them in the back. And there was, in general, at home, not enough support for the military efforts. So what they wanted to do is to, with all means, achieve kind of full support from the home front. And their idea was Jews are bad for them, they are a risk, and they are kind of stepping us again back. But we also don't want to have kind of unrest with the rest of the population. So they feared unrest from the Germans also. So and here's where this comes together in these mixed marriages. They didn't want to kind of persecute them so much that there would be unrest from the German, the Aryan side of the family, because they would witness everything, right? And since family bonds are often stronger than other ones, they would kind of complain, and they would, and so this was the situation till 1941, that they still favored these kind of these mixed marriages. Until then, kind of the dynamic of violence and everything kind of also played throughout these concerns.
And the population of the children or families of mixed marriages was significant enough for the Reich to
Yeah, I mean, if you think there are 100,000 people and they have family and relatives and many are members of the Nazi Party, yeah, I mean.
And actually, many of those privileged mixed marriages were pretty well off. They had a bourgeois background. They had some of them had very good contacts into politics and into the army. Many of them served in World War I. They were veterans. For example, I mentioned this action in Hesse and Nassau in Frankfurt against the mixed married, the intermarried Jews in summer of '43, and they had to stop it because there were so many complaints So people were driving to Berlin, going to the Reich Security main office and presenting themselves there, or other people they knew, they had contacts and they were going to those authorities. And so this was even an issue in 43. And it's only really at the end of the war, this doesn't matter anymore, because then the war is lost. The Nazis knew that about 44 or earlier, depends on who you're asking. And this is the situation where it is changing.
Thank you.
Elaborate a little bit more on, were they able to go into hiding? Did some of them, were they able to survive or go into hiding, even with into families, and also to flee Germany at all, as of 1943, after the factory?
After 43. So
After 43?
yeah, so leaving the country, that's only
Was it possible?
yeah, it was on the mostly on the border to Switzerland, but the numbers aren't that high because the border was very good protected. The thing is more going into hiding, and in intermarriages, or many intermarried families already helped Jews. So they were helping them even if they really had also big concerns, and it was an endangering situation for both, because if a Jew was caught in a mixed married family, there were really severe persecution measures then. And concerning the intermarried Jews going into hiding, many of them were rescued by their husbands, actually. So they tried to find another place, and their relatives were going there and providing them food. But as I told earlier, in 44, 45, the question is not. You have to imagine it's not the same procedure going into hiding than it is in 42 or 43, because it's really a psychotic situation, and it's dangerous, but you have many more possibilities. For example, sometimes it was enough just to go to another place and don't tell the authorities that you moved, and then you are out of the focus.
Seems like the Gestapo's fixation on blood, was pretty granular. How are they able to keep track of all this stuff?
Sorry, can you say that again?
It seems like their focus on, lineage and Jewish blood or bloodlines was really granular. How are they able to keep track of all these things? These people are religious Jews. These people are Jewish by birth.
Yeah.
These people are.
Yeah,
These people are
exactly.
together. They divorced, but they're still dating. That was,
Yeah.
I think you mentioned earlier today that was bad.
So first of all, Germany was a very bureaucratic state, and you have many records. The Gestapo very early get a hold on the files of the Jewish communities. So this was basically the main focus. So if someone was a member of the community, that's pretty clear he's a Jew. But there were also this authority called the Reichssippenstelle, Reichssippenamt. They had to make decisions, and actually they did it. This is a really weird story. They did it on the. They wrote expertises. If it wasn't pretty clear, if you couldn't get a hold on the grandparents, they said, okay, he's looking Jewish, he's looking non-Jewish. So you also have those cases. So it's a mixture of things, but basically, they were looking at the records of the Jewish communities, at the records of the local communities, local authorities. That's the way they did it.
Thank you for your talk. It was very provocative. This image of the eviction from Military District 6 and these people showing up at a labor camp that didn't know they were coming, I think is very revealing about, well, it raises a lot of questions about sort of central command and regional differences. My question is whether the persecution of non-Jewish men and women varied in these mixed marriages varied based on gender? Or did non-Jewish women, were they also sent to labor camps? Or
No, not to camps, but there was a labor deployment for non-Jewish women, intermarried Jewish and non-Jewish women also. For example, in Berlin, there were some factories and they were assigned to work. But this is really difficult to find out about that because all Germans, all national Germans, also were forced in forced labor at that time or in Arbeitseinsatz. But there are some firms in Berlin, some enterprises where there are commandos of those women from intermarried families. But they were not assigned to that what I was talking of, to the labor battalions of the OT. This was only the only women that were there were like of the Jewish context were Jewish intermarried women and Mischlinge.
This may be an impossible question to answer, but do we know anything about what families did after, the surviving families, what they did after the war? I mean, did they, presumably it would be easier to leave Germany after the war?
Actually, you have to imagine most of those intermarried or members of intermarried families, the husbands, they were quite old because mixed marriage was forbidden in 1935. There was immigration also of members of mixed marriages after 1945, but to a smaller extent. And the second thing is they experienced help by non-Jewish friends and relatives. So their ties to German society was bigger, and many of them were Christian, not Jewish. So I would say, or I would argue that most of those families stayed, with exceptions. It's different regarding the Mischlinge. But there also, most of them stayed in Germany after the war. The problem was, in the first years, it was quite impossible to get out of Germany without being a DP, without being registered by UNRWA and ERO. So the problem was you couldn't get a visa, you couldn't get a trip for immigration because there were not displaced persons in the sense of those authorities, because displaced persons were persons who were displaced from their home countries, and those were German nationals living in Germany. So some of them managed also to leave the country, but most of those who left after 1947 or even after in the 1950s. And regarding those families who survived in Germany and stayed in Germany, most of them had really big problems in getting back into society because most of them didn't manage to save property, to save money, because there were many restrictions also for intermarried non-Jewish members of those families, and it was quite impossible to get funding after the war, as I told you, for those families. So if you read those files, those post-war files, it's quite sad. It's differently with the Mischlinge. They also have problems because many of them couldn't get an adequate education, and they have really big problems after the war finding a job. But they were younger. And for the elder generation, it's really hard to get back into the work. And
is there a difference between East Germany and West Germany?
Yes, there is, but I have to admit that I can't say if it's really on the question of. I think what's quite the same is the question of age. Because it was essential to work. If you didn't have any money left, or any property that you could sold, you really had to work. And if you were physically not able to do that because you were 60 or in the 60s and 70s, you had to take relief and aid, and it wasn't possible to get some in the first 2 years of the war, after the war. So this is a different situation towards younger people, basically. This is also a different situation because DPs, there are programs for DPs, not so much putting them back into work, but for providing them with supply, and the German Jews didn't have so much possibilities for that.
Maybe just to add how the situation after the war was for Jews in East Berlin, when they applied to be recognized as they call it victims of fascism. Right. There were a series of questions there. It was a kind of form. And one question was, did you wear the yellow star?
Mm.
And Jews in privileged mixed marriage they didn't need to. So this was kind of already ranking you down. The second important question was, did you ever spend time in a concentration camp? So they didn't. So another point was kind of they were not as valid, and not. It was much harder for them to be recognized as victims for fascism, which then allowed them to apply for extra aid and food. And then there was another discussion in East Berlin, also in general about Jews, because communists would say Jews are more bourgeois, and so it's actually we don't really want to support them. Yeah? So there were among communists, conflicting discussions. Some said no, they are victims like we are, and others said no, but they are very different. And so this was a big discussion after 45.
And here again you have regional differences. In southern Germany it's much more better in the American zone, even for intermarried Jews who were converted to Christianity, because they were accepted as victims of, it's a different term, but as victims of the Nuremberg laws. So they had a better situation in southern Germany. But you have to recall that in Eastern Europe, in Eastern Germany, they didn't accept aid from the Joint, for example. It was impossible. The situation was generally worse for Jews in Eastern Germany, and that's also the reason why many of them tried to come to the Western zones.
How severe were the consequences for being kind of low on the list for?
Can you speak up a little bit louder?
How severe were the consequences for being low on the list for relief? Like if you didn't get much relief because you were privileged, like how severe and long-lasting were the consequences?
So there are some people starving after the war. It's not only the question of, it's a mixture. If your body is really exhausted, for example, if you didn't get put food stamps, you hadn't the possibility to get meat, for example, if you had a Jewish card. And so this is a really severe thing, because there is a typhus epidemic after the war also, and the bodies who were not able to face that, and the people who hadn't enough food, some of them simply died. So this is also the case for other groups, but what you can see in the files is that they're desperately looking for a place to recover, for example. So if they have, if the man is really sick, so they are writing to the Joint, they are writing to the Jewish communities, they are writing to the Christian church, they are writing to the authorities. So please, can you help me? He's dying. We need to change something. You always have to keep in mind that you have to dramatize to get something, but you can find that it's a topic in all those files. So I think it's really true that the people. You also know that Germany after the war, the calories provided to the population was very low. So it was a general problem, but to my point of view, the problem is that those people who were targeted as Jews, like under racial persecutions, they don't get, in the first month, and also some of them in the first 1 or 2 years, they don't get supplementary relief because they are non-Jewish by faith and because they were privileged in the Nazi times.
So they don't get the relief that other German Aryans got?
Other Jews and other...
Forget it.
Well, I mean, they're
Did
getting the
they
Sorry.
get less than the average German?
No,
No, they're getting the same
So they
thing.
got the
So there's no
same-
they're getting the same thing, but or let's say it differently. Many Germans were able to save some of their property, some of the savings. They had things that they could change with other peoples from the countryside, and the persecuted didn't have that at all, or just few things left that were good for the first couple of weeks. This is the big difference. So theoretically, they get the same aid than other German nationals, but in fact, they were not able to get to provide themselves because they didn't have the basis than other Germans had.
So, because they were considered essentially Germans earlier, they were considered Germans afterwards.
It's not so much the question about being considered as Germans, it's the question about being considered not as, or not fully as a Jewish victim. That's the difference. And I have to admit, it's a difficult topic, and there is regional differences. So in Düsseldorf, for example, the first month, the Jewish community, provided also help to non-Jewish women of mixed marriages, because they were argumenting. We have to say many of those surviving in the communities were intermarried. So this is why they tried to provide their families with more food, and clothes was also a big topic. And they managed to do that in the first weeks, in the first month. But it's changing then when the Jewish victims from the camps came back, because then there's a hard fight going on into the communities about who are the victims, and those who survived in Germany. The others are suspicious about that group. So did they collaborate with the the Gestapo? And yeah, it's just, they had a better life. So because they weren't in the camps, and this is really becoming. I think this is really becoming a category for splitting up. If somebody is let's say a real victim, or a half victim, or a 3/4 victim, and this is what is so astonishing for me, that those categories of persecution, they are persisting after 45, and they're affecting the lives of those who survive.
Can you tell us how you got interested in this general topic?
Yeah, in the general topic, it starts in school. Actually, I was in Yad Vashem as just 1 or 2 years before I got my, what's the equivalence of Abitur?
High school diploma.
Okay, high school diploma. So this was really a striking moment for me, very emotional. And then I wrote a thesis in school about Yad Vashem, and I lost the tracks in university a little bit, and then I had the opportunity to do a community service in the town archive of Munich, and they have a really strong department for Jewish history, and I did my intern there, and this is how I got affected. And then I was wondering why this one big camp in Munich, there was nothing on it. In literature, there was just small passage about that camp, and in the source it was so central for those years of persecutions, 41, 42, And this is why I got interested in looking closer to the topic. And actually, this is the point when I met Wolf Brune. I met him in person later, but this is the point I was meeting with his work on those forced labor camps, and that's the point where I started to want to know more about all this topic.
I'm going to share my ignorance. How many German Jews survived the war afterwards? How many people choose to stay in Germany?
In Germany,
10,000?
15.
50,000?
15.
50,000?
10 to 11,000, like in mixed marriages or so-called Geltungsjuden. I don't count the Mischlinge because the Mischlinge weren't Jewish in Nazi categorization. It's another category. And about 4,000 survived in hiding. 3,000 to 4,000 survived in hiding in Berlin. And I cannot tell you how many came back, but you may add another maybe 10,000, but this is already quite high. So in total maybe 22, 25. But we are talking of German Jews. Only German Jews, and not of the. It's not with Austria. It's just the so-called Altreich.
Okay.
Did you follow up on how many ended up reasserting their Jewish identity, or that their experiences so affect them psychologically that they went back to the other way and not in the religion?
Like reconverting to
Yeah.
Judaism?
Yeah. Decided not to.
It's impossible to tell you numbers, but there are some. I think this is a case you have to look at case by case. There are some, but I would argue not so many. Most of them were really, they converted long times ago, or were raised as Christians, and it was never the question of being Jewish. It's different among the so-called Geltungsjuden. Many of them found a way, because they were so hardly pushed into the Jewish community and into the Jewish institutions after 1938. So there are many examples that they became Zionists, for example, an active Zionists, and they emigrated after the war, but not so many about the Mischlinge and the intermarried Jews. So thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you.